passing of former President FW De Klerk, and we continue paying a tribute to his life. He passed away after battling cancer for many years. Joining us now is Mr. Pallo Jordan, former cabinet minister, as well as African National Congress veteran. Mr. Pallo Jordan, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the Daytime Update. Your first recollection or your first reaction when you heard of the passing of former President FW De Klerk, what went through your mind? How do you remember him?
FW spent the greater part of his political life tried to suppress the democratic movement in South Africa. He had to spend the latter part of his life participating in the inauguration of South African democracy. That's one of the great ironies of his life. I would say he'll go down in history as one of the notable Afrikaner politicians of the 20th century, some of whom were the architects of the system of apartheid, and he was the man who was fated to phase it out.
And as far as him being the man that was fated to fade this out, you also spoke about what you call the irony of his life. Talk to us about those transitionary years, as well as the relationship that he had with the liberation movements after their disbandments.
Well, as you know, I think it was 2nd February, wasn't it, 1990, when he announced the unbanning of the ANC, PAC, SACP, DC, the DC movement, etc. And from that moment on, I suppose that he was engaged in somewhat of a wrestling match, both with himself, with his constituency, with his supporters, and with his opponents amongst the Afrikaners. But at the same time had to interact with the National Liberation Movement, principally the ANC. In that interaction with the ANC, blew hot and cold, as you know, between 1990 and 1994, there was the commencement, first of all, of talks. Then there was CODESA 1 and CODESA 2. And one of the reasons why CODESA 1 was postponed or adjourned was because of the incapacity or unwillingness of the De Klerk regime to suppress the activities of the third force, who were intent on disrupting the transition to democracy. You'll remember the violence, not only in KwaZulu-Natal, but especially in the Midrand during those years. And that relationship, of course, had moments in which, there were great tensions between the liberation movement and FW De Klerk, but then there had been moments of cooperation as well.
You talk about the duality of the man, and my colleague Atim Tongana earlier on was, talking about the time when he was being interviewed on an international news station, and he would not concede to apartheid being labeled as a crime against humanity. From your perspective, where was that balance, and what do you believe were some of the challenges that he faced from even perhaps his own Afrikaners for the stance that he had taken, which sometimes seemed to be pro-amalgamation and pro-integration?
Well, obviously, it would be difficult for someone like De Klerk to admit that apartheid was a crime against humanity. You must remember that his father was one of the principal architects and builders of the system. He himself had participated in the system from the time he entered politics. So it would be difficult for him to admit that he was involved in the crime. But at the same time, too, one recognizes that having taken the decision that he would unban the liberation movements and that he would engage for the purposes of transitioning from apartheid to democracy, he'd faced great difficulties. There had been, even before he became head of the National Party, the breakaways of various right-wing formations within the National Party. People remember, what's his name, the son of Barry Herzog, what was his name? I forget his name. And then there were then the other developments in the late 80s and the 90s, like the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging and the Boere Mag, and I don't know what else, right-wing formations that he had to face up to. But I think he had the confidence that the majority of South African voters would support him, which is why he took the country to that referendum in 1992. And there was a 60% endorsement of the course he was taking. So, yeah, in that respect, I think he had calculated very correctly.
Talk to us about the pressure that he was facing from international fronts that eventually led to his stance on the dismantling of apartheid and how he chose to deal with that.
Well, the pressure on the international front wasn't something that happened spontaneously. We had to work for that for some 30 years, beginning in 1960. And it gathered momentum, I think, in the 1980s, reaching its peak in the period 1985 to 1990. And that made it, of course, impossible for the apartheid regime to continue in the manner it had done before. Now, given that we had been able to mobilize the international community in opposition to apartheid in the manner that we did, that was one front that he had to face, and there was no way out there, because once the banks refused to lend South Africa money any longer, that was that. They wouldn't have had the means to finance the system. Internally, there was the struggle of the people of South Africa, and politically, the National Party had lost the battle here in South Africa for the hearts and minds of the people. And given those two, the struggle inside and the international pressure, the only way out was, in fact, to figure out a negotiated way out of the dilemma. And I suppose one has to concede that he had the moral courage to take that gap when it appeared.
Mr. Pallo Jordan, we thank you so much for your time this afternoon as we shine the spotlight on the life of the now late former President of the Republic of South Africa, FW De Klerk.